So I've been hanging out with a bunch of my friends, and they are so into Korean pop music, and that led me to a bit of the question about pop songs in general. I mean, they're really catchy. I mean, you call there's this Ohrwurm, the Germans call it, right? The Ohrwurm, and that means to have like a worm in your ear, like screaming, "Ah, listen to me!" Song that you can't get out of your head. I'm failing to see the beauty in the songs anymore. Just like I'm failing to see beauty in art that I've seen. Modern art does not seem to be timeless. So things like Bach or Mozart, or songs from Beethoven, Symphony Number 9. Oh, was it 9 or 7? Symphony Number 7. Bum, 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 ba-da-ba-ba-da-bum. It's such a beautiful song. These songs are timeless. Would you think that any of these new pop songs will ever be timeless? In like 100, 200, 300 years? Kids, back in my day, Justin Bieber was the shit, homie. That got me to question, are pop songs catchy because they're repetitive in the way they're being sung? And what does it mean to us to have songs that are repetitive that we like? But before I move on, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That will really help me out. So let's talk about music and why. Let's ponder a little bit about repetitiveness in music and see how that goes. Now, what I really wanted to say was that we should stop listening to pop songs a little bit, because I feel like they're redundant, they're repetitive, and we should look more into listening to songs with a bit more depth, with better composition. But then, as a research scientist, I have to put my thinking cap on, and I have to give the other side some stories. And I was trying to figure out whether the repetitiveness in these pop songs are actually correlated to sales, to why do we really like this repetitiveness. And I see that somewhat, right? Just look at how these human beings synchronize and move at the same time in a large mass quantity. Have a look.
Yes, here we go. Pull it to the left. Pull it to the right. Pull it to the left. Pull it to the right.
But and after searching quite a bit, I found this guy called Colin Morris. Colin Morris is a brilliant sort of self-taught programmer who used data science analysis to look at how repetitive lyrics are correlated with the size of compressions, so how much you can compress that file to a zip file. And you do this by looking at, for example, look, builds and thrills, right? They have the same syllables. Let's drop one of these things off, and then you have a sizable reduction, for example. And then on top of that, if the phrase repeats itself, you also drop the other one, and you have the sizable reduction, right? And then you go further, and then you have more and more, and that's how the higher the reduction size means, the more repetitive it is. Okay. So if he looks at it and he looks at the average song, and average song is about 50% on this distribution, whereas if you look at any kind of literature, or this essay, for example, what we're reading right now, is lower than 13%. But what happens here at the higher end here, right? Some songs even go further, all the way to about 98%. And that's the song from Around the World by Daft Punk, which basically just repeats around the world the whole time. But it's catchy, right? That song is really catchy. So, okay, but what does that mean for us? Well, look at this. Compared from the 1960s to 2014, let's say, you have an increase of about 22%. So all this 22% more repetitiveness. So we found a trend. The more repetitive it makes, the more sales that we get. Okay, and the reason why I say the more sales is, well, the top 10% has at least 5% more on this average, right? And it is increasing. It's from here like 1% all the way to like 5% to the end. So, and he goes on further and looking at the people who are responsible for this, and find that Rihanna is probably one of the persons who was responsible for this. Yeah, you can see here songs like Ponder Replay,
Diamonds, American Oxygen. You have very high repetitiveness.
So it seems these pop songs are actually getting repetitive, and if you look at data science analysis from Colin Morris, shows that we are actually the cause of it, right? If there is a demand for these types of songs, then there's a supply. So great, like, okay, so what? Like, we like repetitive songs. Like, with the increase of repetitiveness in these songs, you can see that it's sort of fitting to an algorithm, basically, an algorithmic cash cow, you want to call it, that is going to be exploited by corporations, large corporations whose main aim is to make music to make money, and by the same time, of course, make people famous and things like that. So just look at the Korean K-pop, for example. They have the idea of contract slavery. So what happens is they take children as young as, I don't know, 8, 9 years old, and they basically, and they take them for years, almost a decade, some even up to 13 years, and rob them of their youth, rob them of everything that is needed for them to grow as a human being, to have a better meaning, and instead being used and exploit them to become money-making instruments. Now, even if it's in their own will, right? If you're 13 years old and you want to be the next Taylor Swift, or you want to be the next, I don't know, Blackpink girl band, so what? Like, you can do it. But then again, you're 13 years old. What do you know about life and what's good for you? I mean, if it's a 13-year-old boy and he wants to transition to a girl, might as well just, tra-la-la, just give him some hormone blockers. Or even just help him with the sex transition, right? I mean, you wouldn't do that, would you? Oh wait, we're already doing that. So should it be a guilty pleasure or just pleasure to listen to K-pop music? Obviously, if you like the kind of songs, then they'll make more songs, and by making more songs, you're creating more of these slave contracts, right? It's not a sustainable way of life for them. Just as you might put, like, I don't want to put in the... I don't like these kinds of arguments where you go like, oh, we should not buy things from Nike, or we should not buy things from Walmart because they're exploiting the people and the people are, becoming modern day slaves, which is kind of true a little bit. But do we really need that 5th pair of sneakers, or that 2nd or the 50th pair of pants? I understand it's a symbol of freedom, right? Our freedom that we have earned. We have worked so hard, and now we are free to buy all the materialistic things that we need. But isn't it a selfish fulfillment of our own desires? And if it's at the expense of exploiting other people around the globe, then is it really a noble pursuit, this freedom? I mean, this is basically what's been put forth in the discussion between Slavoj Zizek and Jordan Peterson, right? I understand it is your right to buy these things, but do we really think about the responsibility of having that right? Now, I'm not shitting on capitalism, right? I love the patriarchal results of having things that work. I love public transportations that come on time. I love having roads that stretch for miles, that brings me from one state to the other. Obviously, I love this. I love having internet everywhere I go, obviously. But if we are honest about the tragedies and inequalities of such a system, which is, in a way, it's the most sustainable so far that we have, but it's not a perfect one, right? Because there will always be people who are dispossessed, and there will always be people who are suffering from it. So perhaps, maybe, we should take things in moderation. Maybe not buy that 70th pair of pants that you don't need. So my proposal is not to listen to pop songs anymore, but maybe pause it for a while and listen to songs which are created from the individual themselves and not run by some big corporations who tell you the secret algorithms to the latest, catchiest, repetitive pop songs. I mean, the songs are catchy, but it's almost like a musical echo chamber that's run by these big corporations. So if you follow other musicians like Victor Wooten talks about how music is actually a language, right? It's written in terms of language. Each and every single note that are like words, and by putting one set of combinations of notes here and there, it's like rearranging different words, and then you have a phrase, and from you have a phrase you have a paragraph. And the same thing goes with music, except that music probably has a little bit more layers onto it on top of that. Just like the English language, music, there is no rules about how music is supposed to be written. And believe it or not, even in English language, there is no institute or center which governs and tells you, it's not like the dictionary is a set book which tells you this is how English is supposed to be. It's more of language is more of a thing that's governed by the consensus of the communities, that's not ruled by any one person or any kind of fiat. And any kind of change will only depend on the current times and how the society accepts it to be. Have you ever remembered Be Right Back, BRB? We don't write that anymore because we don't have to be right back from somewhere. We always have things to write on, even if we're sitting on the toilet taking a shit, I'm still writing back to you. I don't have to say BRB anymore. But what this means is that, like English language, music writing is a creativity that's supposed to be coming from the self. Now imagine if Shakespeare was at school at 7 years old, and while writing his brilliant poems, his school teacher said, "No, Shakespeare, that's completely wrong." He'd most likely end up becoming the lyricist for Beyonce's pop songs. And I guess once you get into understanding music, it also gives you some life lessons, right? I mean, it teaches you about the art of listening to people. I mean, you can be a brilliant solo guitarist. I mean, you can play a solo on your own, but if you play a solo and your timing's off with your mates, or if it's not in harmony, that's bad. It's not apparent to me how listening to pop songs, or whether it encourages you to analyze in depth how the song is composed, or the layers and the complexities of how the song is composed. And those are the key things that are important in striking the emotions within you, right? So I caught people like Jacob Collier, who's a brilliant phenomenon. He might be the youngest Mozart of our time. He is able to take pop music and combine it with old classics and jazz it up in such a brilliant way. I do not know, it's baffling to me how he thinks. I saw him in Amsterdam, and he came out of this concert and then leading up this orchestra, and when he was playing his tune Hideaway, man, I cried. Or it could have been the Hash, I'm not really too sure.
My heart away.
In the second verse, he adds this layer of fives. So, and it's made more complex by the fact that the fives are grouped in fours and threes and sixes.
To the
It's, you don't hear the math of it when you're listening to the song. You just suddenly become unmoored in this kind of dreamlike state, and yet you still hear the slow pulse from the original part of the song.
But his complex layering of his song is the thing that sort of elevates me to a sort of higher consciousness a little bit. He put me in a position where I'm not really too sure where I am, I don't know what to feel, but suddenly I felt the emotion of that I need to cry. It's almost like you're being put into a transcendental state that I never knew I had. I mean, it's weird. I mean, I don't understand it. I don't think there's even any science to it, right? Because it deals with sort of the inner psyche a little bit. I mean, I don't understand why I got goosebumps. I don't understand how we got goosebumps. I mean, I tried searching for it. I mean, people talk about how you get goosebumps, or some sort of chemicals is being spewed out in your mind and blah, blah, blah. But why do you get those things? I don't know. Now, parallel to language, if we were to try to translate into words the complexity of these layered compositions that brought me to this transcendental state, then it would turn out to be something like the Quran or the Bible. This is, for example, a visualization of the Bible. Every single line that you see underneath is basically each verses, and the magnitude of those lines at the bottom, they sort of attribute to how many times these things are cited. And the lines on top are showing how they're interconnected with each other. And you might even call this as the first type of hyperlinked, earliest version of hyperlinked book. I mean, you cannot click it, obviously, but you know, that's the type of complexity that you find in these books. So what it means here is that we cannot really derive the meaning from the book properly without understanding the first bits of the book and the last bits of the book and the bits in between. We have to understand the whole book as an entirety to understand and derive the meaning out of it. And this is somewhat translatable to music if it's done right, these layering systems, as what I felt with listening to complex songs like from Jacob Collier. And I suspect that pop songs, man, they don't give you that same experience. I mean, I understand, right? It de-stresses you when you're writing autonomously, passively in your car. You're not listening to it, it's just background music. Or sometimes to alleviate some awkward silence between people you're not comfortable with. It's understandable. But it's almost like a very potent drug that's not so potent in terms of deriving meaning and finding a deeper sense of life, I guess. It's much like the legal drugs like drinking coffee or drinking beer, which is synonymous, works very well in our consciousness and the reality of this mechanical problem-solving reality that we are living in, as compared to other things like psychedelics, which sort of open up your mind and understand yourself and derive a deeper sense of the purpose of your life. So I think actively the key to unlocking these human potentials and finding the purpose is not really to listen passively to pop songs anymore, but sometimes try to actively listen to a more complex song and try to really get geeky and get into the bits of it. I think that's the key component to unlocking the human potential. And it might just even alleviate some of the world's suffering. Maybe.